We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA.
Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome back to Notify America. The Biden administration considering breaking U.S. federal law to keep Ukraine flush, as the Pentagon is down to its last 5 days of cash. December 30th is when the Pentagon says they will exhaust the last of the congressionally appropriated Ukraine military aid. Well, the Biden administration is now desperate, and according to the New York Times, have come up with a scheme to fund another $300 billion to Ukraine, a scheme that is blatantly illegal, and if they move forward with it, will be the final nail in the proverbial U.S. hegemony coffin. But before we get started, press the like button and subscribe. Share the video with a friend, helps the channel out, and I appreciate it. The cesspool of Washington, D.C., folks, is in panic mode. The uniparty, the permanent bureaucracy, is finding themselves cornered. And we all know what happens when you corner a wild animal. They attack, they become dangerous. And that's exactly what's happening right now to the neocons in Washington after the Republican-controlled Congress left for holiday recess without reaching a deal on more Ukraine military aid, which means we only have until December 30th until Ukraine runs out of money to keep the war moving. 5 more days, and due to that, it's already caused the war effort to begin winding down. Ukraine now pausing offensive operations, conserving ammunition, and there's now even reports that Vladimir Putin's looking to strike a deal for a permanent ceasefire. Well, no more war, not even an option, folks. No more milking the U.S. taxpayer. I don't think so. The Biden team has now gone into full nuclear meltdown mode. New York Times writes this: U.S. and Europe eye Russian assets to aid Ukraine as funding dries up. Despite legal reservations, policymakers are weighing the consequences of using $300 billion in Russian assets to help Kyiv's war effort. The Biden administration is quietly signaling new support for seizing more than $300 billion in Russian central bank assets stashed in Western nations, and has begun urgent discussions with allies about using the funds to aid Ukraine's war at a moment when financial support is waning. All right, so just to be clear, this is as off the deep end as it goes. There's a reason why Russia didn't pull the funds that they had lent to the New York Federal Reserve prior to going into Ukraine, because they knew the U.S. wouldn't even consider doing this. The consequences would be so harmful to U.S. interests, it wouldn't make any sense whatsoever, not to mention that it's illegal. We can't do this. The Biden administration cannot do this without congressional authority, which they'll never get. Well, do they care? No, they don't care. According to the New York Times, Biden's team has been conducting high-level meetings over the last week with Treasury, the Fed, State Department, and the Pentagon, discussing how they can make this happen, how they can access the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets that they froze. This is Russian money that is parked in dollars. Some of the money the Russian government lent to the U.S., we're talking U.S. Treasury bonds here, bills and notes, that Russia's central bank bought, like all other countries do, park their money in U.S. dollars because it's considered safe. Well, the U.S. is about to just steal their money because they can just steal it and use it to buy more U.S. weapons to give to Ukraine. These funds, currently held in the U.S., Europe, and Japan, were frozen through sanctions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. Take a listen to Janet Yellen herself being asked about this. She's been asked like multiple times in multiple interviews and hearings in front of Congress that this would be flat out illegal and irreparably harm U.S. interests and the reputation of the United States. This is one of those interviews. Watch.
I think the United States and our partners, it's estimated, have blocked around $300 billion of those assets. And I think it's very natural that, given the enormous destruction in Ukraine and huge rebuilding costs that they will face, that we all look to Russia to help pay at least a portion of the price that will be involved. That said, while we're beginning to look at this, it would not be legal now in the United States for the government to seize those statutes. It's not something that is legally permissible in the United States. Other countries have, legal issues around it as well. And there really are a number of issues. Conversations are really just beginning among countries about how to finance longer-term reconstruction and whether or not those assets should play a role, and if so, how. So I don't really have a lot further news for you on that.
Here's the thing. If they do this, no country would ever feel safe lending money to the Federal Reserve or even keeping their funds in dollars after more than a century of the U.S. dollar building a reputation of safety and security. The Biden administration will destroy it, that legacy, once and for all, not to mention it's a clear violation of the law, an impeachable act, technically, something that demonstrates these people aren't worthy of running the United States. This is like comparable to those stories you hear about those multi-generational family businesses where it took them multiple generations to build the business up, build the reputation up, then a grandson or some grandchild inherits it and destroys it within a month or two. These people have no clue what they're doing, and the media, the institution that should be pushing back on this, exposing how they can't legally do this, should be shaming them for it. Instead, they're cheering them on. The New York Times writes this amount of money that we're talking about here is simply game-changing, said Philip Zilko, State Department official in both the Bush administrations, not surprising, and a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. The fight over this money, which is occurring, is actually, in some ways, the essential campaign of the war. But they go on to write this: seizing such a large sum of money from another sovereign nation would be without precedent, and such an action could have unpredictable legal ramifications and economic consequences. It would almost certainly lead to lawsuits and retaliation from Russia. It would also, by the way, cement the demise of a U.S. world reserve currency. Eastern countries like China and Russia have already been working on a new BRICS currency to replace the dollar backed by gold, something that even allied nations have begun to get on board with. France, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Brazil, even Mexico have all voiced support for an alternative to the U.S. dollar. Well, if the Biden administration were to do this, it would be all that they need to convince any hesitant countries to come along on board with them. All right, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already.